Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks for tuning into Caspian Policy Center's event today. We have an event called the New Caspian Policy for the New Administration. I want to salute our friends in Washington, our audience in Washington, and a good evening to our audience in the Caspian region. Once again, thanks for joining for this very important event brought to you by the Caspian Policy Center. I am Afghan Nifty, Chief Executive Officer of the Caspian Policy Center. Today, we have a very distinguished panel of speakers. We are hosting a discussion on a set of recommendations to the new administration prepared by Caspian Policy Center for more effective U.S. engagement with the countries in the greater Caspian region, including Central Asia and the Caucasus. Often targets of ambitious neighboring powers seeking greater influence, leverage, and advantage, these countries on both sides of the Caspian Sea generally looking for active, visible, uh, and constructive engagement by the US government as well as American private sector. Today, our panelists will elaborate on the ways that the Biden administration can chart the best path forward for the region in light of geostrategic trends and developments that have occurred in the region over the past 4 years. Previously, by our center, we have published a very special report by our advisory board members. It was on our website, and Akbota, our colleague from the Caspian Policy Center, will share the link with all the attendees. Once again, I'd like to especially welcome all our panelists, and I believe this discussion will be very interesting because with the changes in global politics and also the administration in the United States, in the Caspian region, there has been a lot of anticipation and interest to see what the new approaches are, and also they want to hear from Washington about the U.S. Engagement with the region. In this regard, I hope this event will be helpful, and we'll just have a expert discussion and a policy discussion together. And here I'd like to stop and give the floor to Professor Roger Kangas, who is the Academic Dean and Professor of Central Asian Studies at the National Defense University. Professor Kangas, thanks for taking time to moderate this discussion. And I'll give the floor for you to introduce our keynote speaker, George Kent, today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Efkan. It's a pleasure to be here. Should say at my center, the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies, which is at National Defense University, looks largely to the south of the Caspian region, but increasingly, we realize its importance and in fact, the value of the countries in the South Caucasus and of course, across the Caspian in Central Asia. As a quick start to this, it's entitled A New Caspian Policy for the New Administration. Of course, we're talking about the administration of Joseph Biden, who is still in the process of selecting individuals to staff key positions that will work the Caspian region, as well as the broader European space, Middle East space, Eurasian space. Of course, the Caspian has in many ways an interest and a connection to all of these. And so first and foremost, when we look at how we're going to address this, we need to look at the personnel in place, which is why we're so pleased, of course, to have our keynote speaker. The second point to note is, in fact, in the introduction to this program, a thought that maybe over the last few years, there's been a lack of attention on the Caspian. I would say perhaps. What we saw during the Trump administration was very much a transactional approach to foreign and security policy that honestly was focusing more on countries of strategic and financial value or importance to the US. Hence, we saw a great deal of interest in the Gulf states, for example. But were there to have been a second term, we would have probably seen this expand out further in the region. And it's not to say that there was zero attention, but we saw perhaps a quieting down of certain issues that the US normally looks at in the region. What has heightened interest, and I think what we'll start to see as the new administration, is sometimes the framework of great power competition. It's a term of art that is used in the US, perhaps more in the Defense Department than the State Department or other departments. But looking at the world in terms of how does China act? Should we counter this country? How does Russia act? How and where could we counter them if necessary? On and on. And of course, Iran is just to the south of this region and is still a vital security interest to the US. So I throw these out as initial thoughts in terms of how the US could look at the region and perhaps what might be issues at stake. But to really guide us through this, of course, is going to be what I see as four excellent individuals who can read the tea leaves, so to speak, and give us their thoughts on the future of the U.S. In this region and the goals of the new administration. Giving us the leadoff, so to speak, or the keynote speaker will be Deputy Assistant Secretary of State George Kent. It's an honor to have him here. He's responsible for Europe and Eurasia. Previously, he served as Deputy Chief of Mission in Ukraine, spent a number of years working in anti-corruption activities in the State Department, Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement, as well as postings in and around the region to include Uzbekistan. After his initial remarks, we'll hear from Ambassador Richard Hoagland, who his last posting in the U.S. State Department was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asia, held a number of ambassadorial positions in the region from Pakistan, Kazakhstan, and Tajikistan, as well as chargé in Turkmenistan, knows the region intimately and has had a wealth of experience in the Caspian region. Likewise, Ambassador Robert Sekura was recently our ambassador to Azerbaijan. His area of focus is more in the realm of energy and economics. He was the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy Resources, as well as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy Sanctions and Commodities. And in addition to this, held numerous positions throughout the region in his stay at the State Department. And finally, we have Professor Brianne Todd, who's an associate professor at the Near East South Asia Center for Security Studies at National Defense University, focusing on Central Asia. She's as well an adjunct professor at Georgetown University in their Security Studies program, has been detailed to the Office of Secretary of Defense for Policy, working on Central Asian affairs, and has worked numerous projects in the realm of security cooperation for the U.S. in the broader Caspian region, and of course has traveled to all the countries therein. And so with that, I'll close my remarks and turn the microphone over to Ambassador George Kent for his remarks, or for Secretary George Kent for his remarks to start us off. Sir, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Kangas. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be back with the Caspian Policy Center today, even if it's virtually. I'd like to thank not only Dr. Kangas for the introductions, but fellow panelists, Ambassador Hoagland, with whom I served in Tashkent at the beginning of my foreign service career in the early 1990s, Ambassador Sekura, Dr. Todd, Afghan, and the other Caspian Policy Center colleagues who arranged this event. I think as Dr. Kangas said, we're now 6 weeks into the Biden administration. And even as the ranks of policymakers nominated and confirmed continues to fill out and will in the coming weeks, we are conducting policy reviews and developing new approaches to existing challenges. I do think it's important to underscore that the United States' strategic interests in supporting democratic, prosperous, peaceful, and secure countries in the South Caucasus and Greater Caspian region remains steadfast. So to frame today's session, I'd like to share my perspectives on some of the security, governance, and development challenges and opportunities in the region. Please keep in mind, as I've noted in the past CPC sessions that were conducted at the Harvard Club on the margins of the UN General Assembly in New York, that the State Department's regional bureaus divide the Caspian Basin between Central and South Asia, where I started my career, and the Caucasus in Europe, my current area of responsibility. So starting with regional security, given the dramatic developments in 2020 in particular, when I first began meeting with the foreign ministers and other officials from the South Caucasus in 2018, they would usually start framing their country's century-long challenges for statehood, prosperous statehood, as existing within a triangle of traditional empires and modern successor states: Russian, Persian, Iranian, Ottoman, Turkish. And obviously for the Central Asian states, China would be added to that mix. And I do think it's always important to include Turkey when we talk about the external countries with both traditional interests and current aspirations. In 2020, what has been called by academics as the Second Karabakh War acted as a geo-strategic earthquake for the regions. There was 44 days of intense fighting and a subsequent Russian-imposed ceasefire arrangement. Azerbaijan, with Turkish support, reestablished control over parts of Nagorno-Karabakh and its 7 formerly occupied territories for the first time since 1994. The Russian brokered November 9th, 10th ceasefire arrangement left many key issues underscoring the conflict unresolved, particularly the final status of Nagorno-Karabakh. Secretary of State Blinken has committed to reinvigorating U.S. engagement on Nagorno-Karabakh and bolstering support for the OSCE Minsk process, with the United States chairs along with France and Russia, which has been always designed to facilitate Armenia and Azerbaijan charting a path forward. In addition to a strengthened and more confident Azerbaijan, another result of the conflict and ceasefire arrangement is that the external powers that we discussed earlier are newly assertive in the region, or mentioned earlier. So let me go through each of them in turn. Russia has successfully introduced 2,000 so-called peacekeepers in the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh. And that means there are now Russian military boots on the ground in all 3 South Caucasus countries for the first time since the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. After the battlefield losses by ethnic Armenian forces, Armenians feel even more reliant on Russia as a guarantor of their security. Meanwhile, Russia still refuses to withdraw its troops from Georgia, despite obligations it undertook as part of the 2008 ceasefire. Turkey, too, has returned to the region with a military presence for the first time in over a century, since 1920. On the trade front, on the flip side, there may be now opportunities to realize the delayed promise of the 2009 agreement between Turkey and Armenia that was held up because of the ongoing unresolved status of the 7 territories that have now returned to Azerbaijani control. Iran is also posturing to play a larger role in the South Caucasus following the 2020 fighting in the region that also went along its border. Tehran has stepped up diplomatic engagement with all 3 South Caucasus countries, with the foreign minister recently making a swing through the region, but it was largely on the sidelines in the recent fighting. Without a formal role in the ceasefire arrangement, Iran may in some respects be finding itself looking on the outside looking in. Meanwhile, in Central Asia, China's One Belt, One Road initiative promises infrastructure, but often brings debt and limited benefits to the local population. In our view, the goal of China's state-owned enterprises and banks appears to be creating political leverage for the Chinese government to extract the benefits of that investment for China. In our view, Central Asia can also be linked to the world, not just through China, but through international private sector investment, if the governments in the region institute and commit to reforms to improve the business climate. In that regard, good governance and judicial independence are critical. For its part, the United States is committed to working with the countries of the greater Caspian region to create the conditions needed to unlock greater private investment, combat corruption, and secure nations' autonomy from foreign malign influence. We will continue to promote transparency, openness, the rule of law, and respect for fundamental freedoms and human rights. It's worth emphasizing that a justice system with integrity benefits both a country's citizens and foreign investors who can create jobs, driving prosperity and growth at home, so the citizens don't look for opportunity abroad. Some countries in the region have made positive steps forward that are worth recognizing. The presidents of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan have initiated reform programs to strengthen governance and expand space for civil society. In Armenia, the United States responded to the 2018 Velvet Revolution, and Prime Minister Pashinyan's government has admirably remained committed to a reform agenda that would benefit Armenia's society and economy, despite the upheaval following the recent ceasefire. Of course, challenges remain. In Azerbaijan and Central Asia, the United States will continue to press for enhanced respect for human rights, and fundamental freedoms and the rule of law, including the release of individuals widely considered to be political prisoners and detainees. Meanwhile, the recent political developments in Georgia illustrate the need for Georgia to reinforce its commitment to democratic principles, to strengthen judicial independence, and level the electoral playing field if Georgia is to realize its European and Euro-Atlantic aspirations, which we support. As the United States offers support to countries in the region on democratic development, we also see great potential for regional economic cooperation among the Caspian Basin countries and their neighbors. Overshadowed by the ongoing pandemic and outbreak of the fall conflict in Karabakh, the Southern Gas Corridor, a generational project, was completed under budget and on time, with the final trans-Adriatic pipeline segment to Italy completed last December. The United States and the European Union's sustained support for this multinational public-private partnership was part of our long-term goal and commitment to improve European energy security, diversify gas supplies to Europe, and support better regional cooperation. In January, Azerbaijan signed a memorandum of understanding with Turkmenistan on joint exploration of hydrocarbons in the Caspian. This breakthrough, after years of impasse, has the real potential to lead to greater connectivity between the existing energy infrastructure spanning the South Caucasus and the significant hydrocarbon resources of the greater Caspian Basin. And I expect Ambassadors Hogan and Skuda will talk more about that. This initiative could be a real game changer. It represents a rational economic self-interest decision overcoming long-standing hurdles to an interdependent regional network. Talk of cross-Caspian trade, previously held hostage to the disagreement between littoral states, have begun in earnest. One additional sign of this is the recently announced plans to expand Kazakhstan's Port Aktau to enable greater export of goods to Azerbaijan and onwards to Turkey and to Europe. Meanwhile, Afghanistan sees the Caspian region as a key potential export route for its goods via the so-called lapis lazuli corridor. This multimodal corridor has the potential to allow Afghanistan access to Turkish and European markets via Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. Enhancing regional connectivity and promoting economic opportunity for all are among the essential ingredients in this vision. And the same would apply for the Caspian, across the Caspian and the South Caucasus. The United States shares the Caspian region's goal of developing modern infrastructure, diversifying sources of energy and markets for energy, and building competitive market environments. The United States is committed to promoting connectivity that advances national sovereignty, regional integration, and trust. And American companies are ideally suited to help build the modern, secure, and reliable infrastructure, implementing advanced information and communication technology systems in the region. In conclusion, I'm optimistic that increasing connectivity and economic integration of the Caspian and South Caucasus countries, with the support of the United States and partners, has the potential to bring lasting stability and prosperity to the region. And with that, let me turn the mic over to the other speakers for what I am certain will be a lively discussion. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Secretary Kent. And with that, we will turn now to Ambassador Hoagland for his remarks. To you, sir.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to join this important discussion of a strategic part of the world this morning. In order to talk about where the Biden administration should go with policy, I think we need to take a few minutes just to look backward where U.S. foreign policy has been in the region. Over the past quarter century, the U.S. government's focus on the Caspian region has waxed and waned. The sea was thrown open to the world for hydrocarbon deposit development. U.S. companies played a major role in that development. And by the end of the 1990s, the U.S. government had played the leading role in encouraging the construction of the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline that delivered the Caspian's regional hydrocarbons directly to Europe, bypassing for the first time ever Russia's existing pipeline structures. And then when the 9/11 terrorists struck the World Trade Center in New York City, once again, the United States very much needed the countries of the Caspian region for temporary military facilities in Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, and more broadly for the Northern Distribution Network to supply US and NATO troops in Afghanistan. Both of these examples, hydrocarbon development and transportation, and the international fight against terrorism, both of these make clear the strategic, economic, and security significance of the Caspian region. Nevertheless, a faction of Washington's foreign policy community has long looked down its nose at these countries because of their very real problems with political pluralism, human rights, and corruption. More recently, since 2013, the emergence of China's Belt and Road Initiative through the region has made Beijing a major player. At the same time, Russia's President Vladimir Putin has continued to declare the independent countries that were once Soviet socialist republics as Russia's special sphere of influence. Sometimes he goes so far as to declare them Russia's exclusive sphere of influence. But to their real credit, all of these countries, to one degree or another, have practiced what Kazakhstan first called multi-vector foreign policy, meaning that they seek to balance the interests of Russia, China, the European Union, and the United States. During the past 4 years of our atypical presidential administration, a perception developed in some of the countries and among foreign policy analysts in Washington that the US government's interest in the region had fallen, it had waned, it had drawn back. Now, in fact, that isn't really true. We have embassies in every single country, and most important, our wide range of programs for bilateral relations has not significantly been reduced. We have continued our diplomatic, military to military, economic development, educational exchange, and humanitarian assistance programs as we always have, at nearly the same level that we always have. Now, during my diplomatic career, I specialized in public diplomacy, and I can assure you that perception is reality. And if there's a perception that American interest has waned in this strategic region, the crossroads between Asia and Europe, then we have a very clear task before us. The best way that the Biden administration and the Blinken State Department can repair the image of the United States in the Caspian region, I would suggest, is with high-level visits. Hillary Clinton was the last Secretary of State to visit the region in 2010, and no sitting US president has ever visited the region. I would strongly urge President Biden to visit the region, as well as National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, Secretary of State Blinken, and the other cabinet secretaries as appropriate. More than anything else, it's the headline reports of such visits in the mass media and electronic media that raise the profile of the United States in this highly strategic region. It's not just the countries themselves that pay attention to these visits, it's also obviously Russia and China and the other players in the region like Iran. But let's be realistic. Any US presidential administration's foreign policy covers the entire world, and inevitably certain bilateral relations and on-the-ground developments have a way of claiming the lion's share of attention. And the Caspian region is not likely to be at the head of that line. Now, for that reason, I would strongly urge you who are following this webinar today, I would strongly urge you, the officials in the region, US companies with major investments in the region, and foreign policy analysts on both sides of the Atlantic, here and abroad, I would urge you to make a concerted and persistent effort to lobby the Biden administration to make regular, high-profile visits to the Caspian region. After all, as the saying goes, our flag flies highest when all can see it. Thank you. I look forward to the discussion.
And thank you very much, Ambassador Hoagland. In fact, it's important in the context of what Secretary Kent said regarding a wide range of activities the U.S. is and will do in the region, perception matters. And I second your comment about high-level visits going in. I mean, this is definitely a way to shape perceptions. With that, we'll turn to our next speaker, and that would be Ambassador Sekuta, please. To you, sir.
Hi, good morning to everybody, and thank you. I first of all really want to thank George Kent for his remarks. Building on what my colleague Dick Hoagland just said, those remarks are really an important statement in terms of U.S. engagement and thinking about the region. And I know there's been a lot of questions about what's been going on, and I hope everybody takes those remarks to heart and looks at them. I want to switch tactics a little bit. One of the things I think that we need to look at is the economic side of the relationship. And it's something that we haven't really focused on as much as we should have. Economic growth and increased prosperity are important to the region's stability, the country's independence, and their ability to exercise their sovereignty. There are certainly differences in these economies. This is a region that stretches from Turkey through Afghanistan. But there are similarities: youth bulges, strong needs to trust and foster free market enterprise. There needs to be, there's also the question of the adoption of further market-based economic practices and policies, and also the need to create jobs. There is a strong desire among the business people and governments in these countries to boost commercial and other economic engagement with the United States. But for a number of reasons, economic business relations are not as robust as they should be. I want to sort of note here one particular instance, and that has been the strong push in recent years by China to increase its economic ties and presence in the region. As Joe and I recently noted in an article he put out a couple of days ago, around the world today, there are nearly 100 countries that count China as their largest trading partner, compared to 57 for the United States. 100 for China, 57 for the United States. China plans to lend more than $1 trillion for infrastructure projects in its Belt and Road Initiative over the next decade, while the United States has cut back aid. Countries in this region may not want as much Chinese financing or business ties, but they may not have a choice. They don't necessarily have the ready alternatives. So given this situation, building on what Deputy Assistant Secretary Kent said, I would say the United States needs to step up its game, and all concerned would benefit from the United States doing so. And in that regard, I'd like to put forward 5 particular ideas that we might be that the United States government might pursue. 1, the economies of the region have been slammed by the economic effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. We, the United States, should engage and be seen as engaging, building on Ambassador Hoagland's remark, perception here, be seen as engaging with these countries to help them not just get back on their feet, but to build back better, to use this situation as an opportunity for making needed modifications and reforms. This is work we should do bilaterally with the countries in the region, but also multilaterally, working with groups such as the G7, the G20, and the international financial institutions. Second, we should work with partners in the region to foster greater connectivity among those countries. This part of the world is frequently called one of the least interconnected. This needs to change, because with greater connectivity will come greater economic growth and prosperity for the people. This increased connectivity can mean physical connections, i.e. ports, fiber optic cables, but it also means changing systems to make them more interconnected, to facilitate legitimate trade within the country and between the countries of the region and the rest of the world. Third, continue to pursue some of the ideas put forward by the previous administration. The Blue Dot Network is one of these things which could be quite interesting. It could be recast, not so much as some talked about it in terms of China, but looking at this as a way to facilitate legitimate investment and economic growth, fighting corruption, establishing stronger economic ties. These are things which could be done through the Blue Dot Network. And it may be something I know that some of the agencies are looking at, that's something that should be pursued right now. Fourth, and I really want to thank, again, Deputy Assistant Secretary Kent for his remarks on the Southern Gas Corridor and the continued importance of hydrocarbons out of this region. But as we look at this question of fighting climate change, we have to take into account the fact that it's going to take a while to make the transitions that we're talking about doing. That means that oil and gas from this region will remain important for global energy security. And so we need to sort of be working, continue to engage with them on that front. Don't shut that off. Keep working on the traditional energy front. But also let's look at how we can work better on renewables, on new energy technology, and the role that these countries might play. We should look, as we look at the possibilities here for greater solar, greater wind, and also the possibility of greater linkages of countries' electrical grids. At the same time, in doing that, we have to take into account the fact that energy security itself, its definition is changing. And we have to be looking at ways we can work with these countries to help them protect their critical energy infrastructure, other critical infrastructure facilities. Finally, continue agricultural development and other assistance programs that we have going in the region. This is not the time to cut back on our USAID presence. So with that, let me close and turn the floor back over to Professor Kangas. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ambassador. And I appreciate the introduction of a phrase that, at least when it was probably set up, was for a domestic context, build back better, but it's so appropriate when we look at our foreign affairs and relations with our partners in the region, the Caspian region in particular. And so, and the recommendations here, I think, go a good way in helping us build back better in the region. We'll now turn to our last speaker, Professor Brianne Todd, for her remarks as well on the US in the Caspian region. To you.
First of all, thank you to Afghan and the Caspian Policy Center for holding this event today. I think that this is a very timely event, and also congratulations on the release of these recommendations. I think that there is a lot of good information in this report, and I strongly encourage everyone to read it if they haven't already. Also, as Dr. Kangas noted at the beginning, I'm wearing a number of hats these days, so I would just say that the views expressed today are my own and not representative of the US government or any other institution. And to kind of just make some quick remarks before we open it up for discussion, I think I'd like to focus in particular on Central Asia and the aspects related to security. So I would start by saying that, just to remind everyone, we do have a strategy for Central Asia. It was released in February of 2020, which I know seems so long ago because of COVID, and with the distortion of time that has happened over the last year, we all kind of forget that it happened. But we do have a strategy that really lays out what the US government and the interagency's plan is for engagement with the region for about the next 5 years. And I think it's very comprehensive, and I think it gives us a good framework to operate within. And it's really focused on reinforcing things like sovereignty, territorial integrity, independence of the countries in Central Asia. Of course, as we all know, this year, the countries in Central Asia and also in the Caucasus are celebrating 30 years of independence. So we certainly want to reinforce these principles. For Central Asia specifically, we want to partner with them to reduce potential extremist and terrorist threats that are present in the region. We want to work to maintain support for stability in Afghanistan, and of course, along with that, support the peace negotiations that are happening in regards to the conflict in Afghanistan. We want to support connectivity between Central Asia and Afghanistan. And I think overall, in association with that, promote US investment and development in Central Asia. So it's very comprehensive, and there's a lot that can happen in the next 5 years within this framework. Because of COVID, I would say that our plans over the last year have been impacted, obviously, for all countries around the world. But I would emphasize that actually quite a bit has been done despite COVID. When you look at a lot of the bilateral efforts between the United States, the countries in Central Asia, even multilateral efforts, there's still a lot going on. A lot of it, of course, is virtual because of our limitations due to travel and in-person meetings. But we really are trying to maintain connectivity, and I mean connectivity in the person-to-person sense, and to maintain these relationships. A lot of this is in support of things that we hope to do post-COVID, but certainly this hasn't just abolished all plans. Certainly there are things that are still in the process of occurring. I think that, there are noteworthy efforts that have happened despite COVID. You look at the fact that Kazakhstan just repatriated a group of refugees from Al-Hol refugee camp in Syria. Uzbekistan just repatriated citizens from Afghanistan. We're working with the countries in the region. They're doing a lot of things behind the scenes. I think that these efforts don't always get a lot of attention because they're being done very quietly, but they're certainly very noteworthy, and we should draw attention to them because we certainly want to support these efforts. I think another issue that everyone's thinking about right now is what happens with Afghanistan. I wish that I had news. I don't think anyone in Washington has news right now. Much like many issues for the Biden administration, our policy toward Afghanistan is under review. So everyone is waiting to find out what happens next. Certainly that leaves a bit of uncertainty for the region, but I would say not so much insofar as it concerns our relations with Central Asia. That, I think, is concrete. Those relationships will be there regardless of what happens with Afghanistan. Even with Afghanistan, regardless of what happens militarily, that relationship is enduring. So it's not like we are withdrawing from the region. I would reinforce the point that Ambassador Hoagland made, which is, there's this perception of US interest waning. I agree entirely with his comments that that is not true. If anything, I'm seeing signs of increased activity, increased interest, and really it's going to come down to what can our partners handle? How much bandwidth do they have? I think that there's a lot of interest right now in the Biden administration, and there's a lot of energy. And I don't know if the countries in Central Asia are ready for that. So be prepared because we could have some rejuvenated efforts coming our way. I also agree with Ambassador Hoagland's remarks about more high-level visits. I would love to see a presidential visit, but even if we couldn't get a presidential visit, a vice presidential visit, with the increased emphasis on things like women, peace, and security, I think it would be amazing to have our female vice president pay a visit to the region. So I would support that wholeheartedly. I would love to see Secretary Austin go out to the region after we find out what our policy is going to be toward Afghanistan, make a trip to the region, visit Afghanistan, but visit the countries in Central Asia as well. So certainly I agree with the recommendation that we have more high-level visits because I think a lot can come of that. Those were just some remarks that I wanted to make. I know I'm out of time. So with that, I will turn it back over to Dr. Kangas.
Okay, thank you very much. And again, I think all of the remarks here have really provided us a wide range of sort of avenues where the U.S. can, should, or may engage in the region. I want to acknowledge up front that unfortunately, Secretary George Kent had to exit. It's obviously a very busy day at State, and I suspect much in the line of what Professor Todd said with respect to there is engagement and activity in this region. We have some questions coming in, and so I'll actually just offer one out first, and then we'll turn to our audience. And it's a pretty simple question. The three of you have noted one, perception is important. We need to show that we're engaging. Secondly, we are engaging and there's the potential to do more. And thirdly, of course, this engagement can come in a variety of ways: economic, security, but also person to person. We can think in terms of educational exchanges, etc. Here's the challenge. We want to engage, but we're going to probably have to do this in an era of limited resources. Thinking of the US as a country that's cash strapped is hard for others to maybe imagine, but in the coming year or years, this is inevitably going to be true. There's a COVID bill to pay. All of our countries are going to have to pay this. As literally trillions of dollars are being pumped into the domestic economy to make sure that it stays afloat during this pandemic. At the end of the day, this has to be covered. So my question to you all is, how do we continue to engage with the potential for limited resources in foreign affairs and in regional engagement? And I would add a corollary. Do you think that this would provide opportunities for us to work through international organizations? Is that a way the US can engage as opposed to strictly bilateral engagement? And any and all are happy to, willing and happy to answer this. So back to you. Brianne, you can start.
Sure, I'll take a gander at this. So first of all, I would say that I agree with your comment, Dr. Kangas, about limited resources. I think part of it is going to be more creativity on the US side, in the sense of, we're thinking how we can use the resources we have more smartly. The other thing that I would emphasize is that there is a perception of the countries in the region as recipients of assistance, meaning we have to give them money. Increasingly, what we're seeing is a partnership where countries are giving funds in kind. So if we give $20 million, then they will match those funds, and together we have a pot of money with which we can work. This is happening with a number of countries right now, specifically Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. And I think it really forces everyone to make some hard choices as far as what are things that are nice to have versus things that we would like to have, or that are necessary to have. And it becomes then a partnership where we're working together with funds that are vital for things that we absolutely need to have. And so I would emphasize that this is a partnership. This isn't just recipients of assistance from the United States. And so I agree with you. I think that there is going to come a point where we will have even more reduced resources than we have now, but we're anticipating this and we're already working this into our plans.
Okay. Okay, Ambassador Hoagland, and then we'll go to Ambassador Sekuta, please. So.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to second what Dr. Todd just said. Look, over the whole period of our relations with every one of these countries, our financial resources for the countries have waxed and they've waned. They've gone up and they've gone down. But the important thing is that our relationship has remained steady. The thing is that there's a perception that you are closer to a country when you give them more money. And that's not necessarily true. It's all based on the relationships that are built. Relationships of trust, relationships of understanding. And when we build those relationships, both through high-level visits and the day-to-day work on the ground in the countries through our embassies, that's when the relationship, the many, many, many strains of the relationship all come together, and it forms a more steady kind of long-term relationship. I'd add one more thing, though, for relationships and people.
Oh.
The countries and the regions we're talking about has an embassy here. Everyone has an active ambassador. And we happen to be in a period right now when a number of the countries are going to be changing their ambassadors. Some have been recalled for higher level positions. So we're watching that play out in the next coming weeks. What I would like to see is once all the new ambassadors are in place, that they start working together themselves from the region, and that they as a group begin to petition the various important parts of the US government, the State Department, the Defense Department, the National Security Council, the Department of Energy, the Department of Commerce, work together as a group to say we are a strategic region and we want a stronger relationship. I think that would be something that could be done right here in Washington too.
Okay, and Ambassador Sekida, to you for your thoughts on this, and then I'm going to ask you a couple of follow-up questions that are coming now from the chat room. So first on the general issue, and then we'll get specific.
I agree with what has been said so far, and I think actually I want to come back to something that you said, Professor Kangas. That is the role of multilateral diplomacy.
Mhm.
It's not that we only have to deal bilaterally, but we can deal through every possible front, whether it's individual connections between Americans and people in the region, academic connections. But I think right now, especially, I want to come back to this point about the opportunities in a way that the pandemic has provided. This is a time now to be talking about science. This is a time now to be talking about public health. This is a time now to be also thinking about, again, how we restructure after this to never go through this again, or hopefully avoid going through this again. And multilateral institutions are going to be very important in this. Obviously, WHO is one. The United States is now back into multilateral diplomacy. I think as the US gets back into multilateral diplomacy, our diplomats need to take that not just in terms of, oh, it's a discussion in Geneva, it's a discussion in Vienna, it's a discussion in New York, but what does that mean in Tashkent? What does that mean in Baku? What does that mean in Ganja? And get that point out to people, make that relevant to the local audiences. I think one of the things which has also probably been a victim of a pandemic has been a lack of engagement by our diplomats with the whole countries in which they're assigned. Get them out of the office once they get their shots and can do so. Get out with people. Get away from the computer and talk to people. Engage, and then, but be creative. Take what we're doing with an agreement in the bank or the fund to increase the amounts of money to help countries cope with the pandemic and get that out to people so they understand it. This is the kind of creativity I think we need to do. And, you know, my whole time, 40 years in the State Department, we were always short of money. Use what you've got, realize resources are constrained, but be creative and be energetic.
Okay. Now, excellent remarks and so true on the budget issue. Two quick follow-ups for you, sir. The first is from Jeremy Cohen, who touches on the Blue Dot Network that you referred to in your opening comments. And just simply, how likely is it that this will be continued by the Biden administration in their plans for South and Central Asia? And then secondly, from Ilham Akbarov, we have the question about energy companies, and as certain companies really seen as the flagship of our engagement in the region, such as, Exxon and Chevron, are leaving or lessening their presence in the region. Do you think there will be other U.S. flagship companies, energy, renewable, telecommunications, et cetera, that would come in with the new strategy to build back better? So to you.
Okay, thank you. First of all, in terms of what the administration is thinking about the Blue Dot Network, I will have to plead ignorance. I do know it's one of the things which is being, they are looking at things as you come in. This is a normal thing when a new administration comes in. You look at what's going on. What do you want to continue? What do you want to change? Frankly, it's a good idea because it helps you kind of get rid of some of the dead wood. But I think one thing I just want to come back to on the Blue Dot Network, this was an idea I think that was developed in conjunction with Australia and I think South Korea, but we need to check on that. But it was not just a US idea. Japan, maybe rather than South Korea. But the idea here, much of this was sort of looking at the realities, as I said before, these countries need investment and they may not have a whole lot of choices in the matter. There's also the reality of corruption throughout the region. And so the Blue Dot can be a useful tool in helping get sound investments made and done in a way that is guarantees transparency, fights corruption, and then also kind of gives a good housekeeping seal of approval to investors because money is a coward. And there are a lot more demands for capital than there is capital out there. And so I would look at whether it's called Blue Dot or they change it to something else. But with the idea of engaging with this region to increase its access to funds. This is a problem right now. This part of the world does need capital investment to create jobs, to create infrastructure, to create companies. to reinforce what's already going there. Coming to the second question. There are a lot of US flagship companies that you might not be thinking about, whether it's the big accounting firms, oil services companies. This was one of the things which I worked on over the years, was you think, yes, I mean, and good friends at ExxonMobil, Chevron, Marathon, Phillips, Oxy. But it's not just the producers, it's the companies that help make the products that get the stuff out of the ground. It's the companies that provide the, also, work on seismic, all sorts of things. But one area where I think where we really do need a little more emphasis or a little more effort in this part of the world is in the financial sector. A common problem I've heard has been lack of access to U.S. capital institutions, and this may be something which we could be which we could be working on. But I would certainly say there are lots of U.S. companies out there, whether producing product or providing immediate services, that are engaged, willing to be engaged, and maybe their profile just needs to be raised a bit. Thanks.
Nope, thank you very much. Wonderful responses to that. I'm going to actually tie together, we have 3 questions on security issues, and I'll just post these now, and I'll probably highlight a couple of our speakers to hone in on their responses. The first by Bunyad Tilahajayev, who asked about about Afghanistan, and there was the first trilateral Uzbekistan-U.S.-Afghan meeting, which was held. What measures might be taken in order to promote this trilateral format of dialogue in 2021, and particularly keeping in mind that the US is coming up with a pretty important deadline in May of 21 regarding the status of troops in Afghanistan. Second question by Alice Wells, known to you all, who asked about Nagorno-Karabakh. Daz Kent called it a geostrategic earthquake. Do you agree that this is correct, including and looking specifically at the role of the US, which, perhaps during that period of time last fall was peripheral? The question is, does the OSCE Minsk still have relevance when regional actors see more to gain by partnering with more assertive powers in the region? That is this becoming more of a Turkey-Russia format than a multilateral structure? And then lastly, Amir Alizadeh asks the important question about Iran. US sanctions against Iran have immense negative impacts on infrastructure projects in the region. So when we talk about connectivity, let's keep in mind there's a huge chunk of land, so to speak, that's blocked off. And the question is, shouldn't the Biden administration review these policies of economic sanctions, particularly if they, and I would say, if they may help our partners in the Caspian region? I'm going to turn to Professor Todd first, particularly on the Afghan question, and then we'll go Ambassadors Hoagland and Sekuda in this order. So, Brianne, to you.
Sure. So on the Afghanistan trilateral with Uzbekistan, to my knowledge, I think there are more meetings planned this year. I think, of course, with COVID, the hope is to elevate this from virtual meetings to in-person. And of course, as Ambassador Sekuda mentioned, as everyone gets their shots and travel resumes, that would be ideal. I think there's also some hope that eventually this can expand so that the trilateral format is utilized with some of the other neighbors in Central Asia as well. Nothing definitive on that. But certainly, as Dr. Kangas pointed out, as we get down to this May timeframe for Afghanistan, I think you're going to see more dialogue occurring in these trilateral formats. I'll also quickly answer on Iran. I think that much like other policies, the sanctions on Iran are probably currently under review, certainly the maximum pressure policy. But the other thing that I would note is this has always been something of a US policy towards Iran. And so this isn't a Trump administration effort that the Biden administration is now trying to undo. But what I would say is that in the meantime, the countries in the region have found ways to work around it. So I think that's what remains to be seen, is how the Biden administration decides to deal with Iran. how they decide to either continue or undo some of these sanctions, and then how the countries in the region respond as a result of that. Thank you.
Okay, very quickly, because I know we have a time constraint here. So Ambassador Hoagland, couple minutes on your thoughts on any or all of these questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Congas. I'm going to focus in on Nagorno-Karabakh and that question that was raised there. I was the U.S. co-chair in the Minsk group in 2017. And so I know the problem pretty well. I know the region pretty well. I have traveled frequently into Nagorno-Karabakh itself. Look, what this does is emphasize the strategic importance of the region once again. What happened was during the 44-day war, Russia predominantly, but certainly with Turkey's support, changed really the reality on the ground. Nagorno-Karabakh had always been linked with what were called in the modern period, the post-Soviet period, the prolonged conflicts, like the conflict in Transnistria and Moldova and Crimea and Ukraine, the problems in Georgia. And what this did was fundamentally change one of those frozen conflicts. Russia took charge at the end. And what it was to Russia's immense positive end result, I would say, because Russia now has boots on the ground. Russia was perceived as changing reality on the ground, but they didn't go all the way. They have still kept it so that Russia will predominate in the region. I think that's all the more reason why we, the United States, need to raise our high-level public profile in the region with higher-level visits. Inevitably, those kinds of visits will then have to discuss this kind of question, and that will then seep out into the broader world. Russia will pay attention, China will pay attention, Iran will pay attention, but higher-level attention in a real way would make this a little bit more interesting.
Thank you. And Ambassador Sekyev, regretfully, a very brief response to any or one of the questions noted. To you, sir.
I'm going to be very brief. One, I agree with Brian. The questions about Iran and sanctions go back to the fall of the Shah. Mm-hmm. And I think that's all going to be part of a much broader review of what to do with Iran, the very complicated negotiations coming up on JCPOA and other issues with Iran. But at the same time, I don't think that it's really much of a factor in terms of limiting infrastructure development or connectivity within the region. Second thing, I do want to come back, and this is build on some of the comments Ambassador Hoagland made, and I think especially the very important remarks of George Kent. The November agreement that was brokered by Russia does not resolve all the issues in Nagorno-Karabakh between Azerbaijan and Armenia. The United States needs to be involved here in terms not of really a peace building. And that is something that I think is complicated. This is not all put nicely to bed yet. There's a lot of emotion on both sides, a lot of anger, but the United States has a real capacity here, and we need to be using it. So with that, let me turn it back to you, Roger. Thanks.
Okay. No, thank you very much. And thank you all for your responses. I'll add one final comment before I turn it over to Afghan. It's simply, in the chat room, there's a comment by George Kroll that I do think is important, which states that, the prospects, really, what are the prospects for the leaders in the region to genuinely undertake change in their countries? In some ways, the role of outsiders, the US among them, is going to be limited if we're thinking in terms of long-term engagement. And I would turn to our friends here at the Caspian Policy Center. That's a wonderful topic for a future discussion in terms of enacting reform and change. But I want to thank you all for your remarks, your comments, your honesty here, and really for the opportunity to discuss this most important topic. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to our host. Afghan, back to you.
Thank you, Professor. Thanks everyone for joining our discussion today. I'd like this opportunity to thank all our speakers, Das Kent, Ambassador Sikuda, Ambassador Hoagland, Dr. Todd, and also Professor Roger Kangas. I think this was a very important discussion because a lot of things in the region are changing. There are consequences of the COVID situation as well, which is has to be dealt by the countries as well. I believe that there is multifaceted opportunities for the United States to engage with the region, and our renewed engagement with the region will be very important, not only for the region itself, but also for the US policy. I look forward to continue our discussions on this area. One thing that I want to highlight is that our report is out on our website. We shared the link with the attendees, and I am glad to see regional engagement, especially on the questions side. There was a lot of questions from the audience, and also we didn't get the opportunity to respond all of them perhaps, but we will continue to look forward for their emails and feedback, and we are happy to engage with every one of them. Also, I'd like to highlight when it comes to US engagement with the region that we will be holding our 5th Trans-Caspian Forum in April. And I'm glad to see more countries are joining from the region this year. And as Ambassador Hoagland mentioned, that we have new ambassadors from the region coming in as well. We look forward to host a very important discussion regarding the region, continue our traditional Trans-Caspian Forum, which will be joined by the Central Asian Caucasus countries and also Turkey as well. We have seen the mention of Turkey in this discussion, and I'd like to draw your attention and look forward for our invitation through the email that we'll be sending out. Once again, I also want to highlight the Das Kent's remarks today. I think that was very timely in terms of expressing renewed engagement with the Caspian region. Once again, thanks for tuning in, and we look forward to continue our discussions. And please stay engaged with the Caspian Policy Center. And finally, I'd like to thank our Caspian Policy Center team for putting this event together. Have a great rest of the day, and also have a great evening to our audience in the region. We look forward to talking to and to engaging you in the future. Thank you.